All right, welcome, football fans, to a Monday morning episode of the Call Sheet Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Smith. It is Memorial Day, beautiful day in my neck of the woods here in southern New Jersey. The sun is shining. The weather has warmed up a little bit. Hope it's a beautiful day wherever you're listening as you celebrate the end of this holiday weekend and what really feels, I think, for a lot of people like the kickoff to summer. But it is Memorial Day, and that's a complicated day in many regards for a lot of people as we remember the fallen, those who gave their lives in service of this great country. And it's a day where this is a football podcast, and it gives us an opportunity to recall one of the more fascinating and complicated individuals who lives or lived at the intersection of these two worlds, war and politics and football. And that is former Arizona Cardinals safety Pat Tillman, who was killed in April of 2004 fighting for U.S. Army Rangers in Afghanistan. Tillman's story is fairly well known. I'm going to remember it today and talk about his life, his legacy, some of the questions that have arisen in the 20 or so years after his death. It's a really complicated and fascinating subject. Hope you'll take this short journey with me. I was a history teacher for 33 years. I think anybody who's listened to this show now, we've talked about this, and it really influences the way that I try to run this podcast, because I think this podcast should be about more than just the game of football. It's absolutely, its focus is on football. But if we can bring in some of the history that surrounds the game, whether it's cultural, political, I try to stay away from the political stuff, but whether it's cultural, social history, the circumstances that existed in the country as this great game of football was evolving, then I try to fold those things in. War's a tough one, though. War is a very tough subject. I mean, we could probably debate all day what constitutes a justifiable war versus an unjustifiable war. That's a matter of opinion for a lot of people. There are those who believe that if the country calls you to serve, you serve. And there are others who say, well, you don't potentially put your life on the line without asking some serious questions about the nature of that service. What are you serving? Whose interests? What purpose? Is it for the betterment of the country? Is it truly for security? Or is it for the interests of the few looking to advance a specific agenda, whatever that might be? That muddies the water for a lot of people. And so again, when we talk about war, I don't ever think that it's a simple discussion. And I'm not getting into the politics of all of this. The facts about how we arrived in Afghanistan are fairly simple. The 9/11 bombings, the Taliban government of Afghanistan harboring the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, harboring Osama bin Laden, and the United States responding in the aftermath in an effort to smash Al-Qaeda and ultimately capture and kill bin Laden. Iraq is a much more complicated subject. Won't get into that. A lot of people question the motivations as to why we went to Iraq specifically. But either way, it was a difficult time in American history. If you are old enough, as I am, to remember the events of 9/11, it will be one of those things that stays with you for the rest of your life. You will never forget. For my parents' generation, I think that thing was the Kennedy assassination. I think everybody from my parents' generation will remember exactly where they were, what they were doing, who they were with when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. For my generation, Generation Xers like myself, it will be 9/11. As far as Pat Tillman goes, his story. Pat Tillman grew up in California, had two other brothers, played baseball, played football, was an undersized football player for his position. He played linebacker, but he was about 5'11" and 200 or so pounds, really not big enough to play linebacker on the major college level, but he still managed to earn himself a scholarship to Arizona State University, where he went. And the Sun Devils did, in fact, play him as a linebacker, although it was kind of more of a linebacker hybrid safety role. He was a fantastic safety. In the 1997 season, he led the Sun Devils to an undefeated regular season and a Rose Bowl berth. He was a first-team All-American. He wore the number 42, which is really appropriate when you consider that was the number of Ronnie Lott, arguably, by the time you get to the year 2000, the best safety to ever play the game at that time. And Tillman leads Arizona State, along with Jake Plummer, the quarterback who would then go on into the NFL, into a Rose Bowl berth. They wind up losing to Ohio State. Tremendous run. But because of his size and the fact he was kind of a tweener, he's not drafted till the 7th round by the Cardinals, taken in the 7th round, goes into Arizona, makes the roster, quickly becomes a starter. And in the 2000 season, Pat Tillman records 155 tackles, leads the NFL in tackles from his safety spot with 155 tackles. And he's offered a free agent contract as he heads into 2001, the last year of his rookie deal. He's got the opportunity to explore the market, and he's offered a $9.6 million deal by the St. Louis Rams. That's a big contract in 2001. And he turns it down because he was loyal to Arizona. He didn't want to leave Arizona. Would ultimately be offered a lesser deal, a $3-point-something million contract from Arizona, which he probably would have taken, but the 9/11 terrorist attacks occur. And then Tillman would play out the rest of the 2001 season after those 9/11 attacks. And that's ultimately when he earned the contract extension offer from Arizona. But he turned it down. He turned it down because he decided to enlist in the U.S. military to go serve his country after 9/11. He didn't talk a lot about it publicly. He didn't really speak about it because he didn't want the focus to be on who he was. I mean, he got a personal letter of congratulations from then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld after his enlistment. That was not something that the Army did, but they recognized this is a high-profile guy. This guy had made All-Pro. He was an All-Pro in 2000. I mean, he was not an anonymous name. He was also a white safety. There weren't a whole lot of white defensive backs in the NFL. And that story, the story of an all-pro safety in the prime of his career, turning down a significant contract offer, who just happened to be a white kid who'd be a great poster child or poster boy or poster man, you know, whatever the proper phrasing is there for the U.S. Army, was something that was very tantalizing. It was a great recruiting tool for the Army, but Tillman didn't want any part of that. And he talked about that. When he spoke very briefly about why he had enlisted. He said his great-grandfather served at Pearl Harbor. His parents had always talked to him about the need to both A, question authority, but also B, serve your country if you believe that your service was worthy and justifiable. And in this instance, Pat Tillman did. So he and his brother Kevin, who at the time was playing minor league baseball, enlisted together. And they went through training and eventually qualified for Army Rangers, were first sent to Iraq, and in 2004 were sent to Afghanistan. So it's a fascinating story as to how he arrives there. Just 2 weeks after his deployment to Afghanistan, Pat Tillman is killed in a very, very volatile region of the country, the Coast Province near the Pakistani border, which was a Taliban stronghold. And his battalion is there, and their job was to go pretty much town by town to the little villages in the province and root out Taliban, seize whatever weapons they could find, interrogate locals, and capture Taliban if they were there. It was a very dangerous part of the country. I mentioned it's near the Pakistani border, very mountainous terrain, difficult to maneuver through. And the source of the trouble on the day that Pat Tillman was killed began when a Humvee that his battalion was operating broke down in one of these canyons in between these difficult mountain ranges that were within the region. And they sort of sat there for hours upon hours as they tried to get direction from command about how they were to proceed. They knew they couldn't leave the Humvee. It's a multi-million-dollar vehicle equipped with the most state-of-the-art technology of the day. It had a massive gun attached to it. They couldn't leave it behind. Some of the people in the battalion wanted to blow it up, but ultimately the command ordered them to tow it. That there was a paved road. There was one paved road in the entire coast province, and that paved road was just outside the canyon. They ordered them to tow the Humvee through this treacherous canyon and then out onto the paved road where they would be able to get it back to a base to repair it. But the controversial decision that they made was, while they ordered part of the battalion to tow the Humvee, they ordered the other part of the battalion to split up from them and go to the nearest village and continue with their mission of interrogating locals and rooting out Taliban. And in the midst of that, as the battalion split in half, which many of the soldiers in the battalion felt was a bad idea, that you never wanted to split the battalion, especially in the midst of enemy territory and in a region where the Taliban were known to ambush fighters, to be able to use the geography to their advantage and to be able to ambush opposing armies. They split up, and of course that's what wound up happening. Part of the battalion is ambushed, and in the midst of the firefight, the other part of the battalion comes around and winds up approaching the firefight from the opposite end, so that the two U.S. groups are facing one another in the midst of this firefight. And Pat Tillman is shot and killed by his own troops, friendly fire, which I've always thought is a is a pretty unfortunate name, the idea of friendly fire. And then, of course, if you know this story, you know also that the U.S. military tried to cover this up, that they recognized that Tillman's death as a result of friendly fire would be controversial. And so initially they reported it as he was killed in combat by Taliban fighters, by enemy combatants. Only after the funeral, the service, and all of those things had been put to bed did the military inform the Tillmans that their son had been shot by his own troops mistakenly in the midst of this confusing situation. And so that led, of course, to a long investigation. Why the cover-up? What was the military trying to do? There were all sorts of stories about how Tillman's clothes had been burned, his journal had been burned. There were a conscious effort to sort of erase the circumstances of that day so that the military could have the story that they wanted. The Tillman family, of course, in the aftermath, extremely critical about it all. And in the end, we are left with a legacy of Pat Tillman that is a complicated one. His political views, which first led him to leave the NFL to go enlist because he believed so much in the cause. He believed in defending the country after the 9/11 attacks, changed sharply when the United States invaded Iraq, which he believed to be an illegal and immoral war. He wrote extensively about it, that he understood Afghanistan, that he supported it, that he willingly went to Afghanistan to fight, but Iraq was a very different animal. And he did not support that war, and he was very critical about that war. And that angered some people in the military because, as you can imagine, he was a extremely high-profile soldier. He wasn't any soldier. There's also, over the last 20 years or so, been accusations that the NFL has exploited Pat Tillman's death for its own gain, using his image. There was an actual I don't even know what to describe it, a trailer, but that's probably not the right word. But the NFL put out about a 2-minute film before this most recent Super Bowl, which was played out in Arizona, where a young boy is running, with a football, and he runs by the statue of Pat Tillman outside the stadium there in Glendale, and the camera freezes on it, and you kind of have this reflective moment. And questions arose as to what is that about? Is that really about honoring Pat Tillman because the NFL had done things like that in the past, or were they looking to create some sort of gain because of the fact that he's remembered as such? It's a story that is just so complicated to tell because, well, I think Pat Tillman was noble. And while I think that what he did, now think about what he did. He walked away from millions of dollars in the prime of his career to serve his country. But in doing so, as a high profile individual, brought a lot of attention to himself, which some people in the military are uncomfortable with because they don't believe, obviously, that is why you should join. And some feel maybe he and his brother, because of their name, got some special treatment that allowed them to be appointed to or qualify for this elite Ranger unit. You have the cover up, you have the NFL angle. It's a complicated story. But for me, at the end of the day, and I'll end with this, it's just really about the character of who he was. I think Pat Tillman lived his life by a code that is rare these days. And his death is over 20 years ago now. So to say these days is kind of antiquated. He really was a product of a different generation. But he was a product of a thought process that said, you have a code by which you define your life. And that code is non-negotiable. And when it's violated, then you uphold the code. And I think in his mind, the code was that you stand on principle, whatever those principles might be. And I won't pretend to speak for him, but from what I've read, his principles involved standing up for people and for what he believed was right. In John Krakauer's fabulous book about the Pat Tillman situation called Where Men Win Glory, there's an anecdote early in the book about Pat Tillman fighting neighborhood bullies in defense of his friends and brothers because he believed in standing up for them. And it feels as though every step of the way that he lived his life with those principles in mind. And I think that is a rare thing. So while we remember all of the individuals who gave their lives on this Memorial Day in service of their country, when we get to the Pat Tillman story, I think it's a great reminder that you have to have principles in life. And those principles can't be slogans, and they can't be used to market a thing, and they can't be just idle words. I mean, by definition, a principle is something that you stand for. You stand for, which means you defend it. And that's, for me, the legacy of Pat Tillman. Standing up in defense of your principles. And if we take nothing from his story other than that, then that's a worthwhile thing. All right. So whatever you're doing today, if you're barbecuing, if you're playing golf, if you're heading to the beach, if you're taking a bike ride, just take a moment and reflect on the people whose service has given us all the opportunity to do these things, whatever these things might be. The freedom to do what we want to do is not something arrived at by accident. All right, I will be back tomorrow with reflections on 100 shows. This is actually the 100th show of the rebooted Call Sheet Daily. This is my 100th show since I started doing this in January. And I'm going to reflect on some of the things I've learned. What are some of the things I've learned about uh, football from a lot of the great guests I've had on about this new venture here into the media world. It's going to be cool. It's going to be a cool reflection. So hope you'll join me for that show tomorrow. Until then, have a great Memorial Day, everybody. Take care.